Oh,
All right.
somebody's coming in, so okay, got it. Then admit.
Thank you. Well, I'll go ahead and get started. So welcome, everybody. Welcome to our first lunch and learn of the new school year. The topic is navigating cultural bias in special education. My name is Olga Marable. I'm the Director of Admissions and Outreach for Fusion Academy Rockville. And for those who aren't familiar with our school, I just want to share a little bit. So Fusion Academy is a revolutionary private middle and high school serving 6th through 12th grade, where positive relationships unlock academic potential. All courses are one-to-one, one student and one teacher per classroom. This allows for teachers to customize curriculum and teaching for each student's individual strengths, interests, and learning styles. Our supportive campus environment is a unique space that includes a state-of-the-art recording studio, mixed media art studio, and a homework cafe where students complete all homework before returning home. Flexible scheduling lets students enroll at any time of the year through rolling admissions and take classes at any time of the day that works best for them between 7:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. Monday through Friday. In addition to full-time or part-time school students, we also offer tutoring support, and we have over 250 course offerings. We offer a fine balance between academic as well as social emotional support through the homework cafe, clubs, and activities. We have 7 campuses in the DMV area, including DC, Loudoun, Reston, Tysons, Alexandria, Rockville, and Columbia. Our campuses still have openings, so feel free to reach out if you have any interest and want to discuss further. A little housekeeping before we get started. As I mentioned, this is being recorded. Feel free to turn off your cameras if you'd like, but the recording will be sent to everybody who's joining today, as well as anybody who registered and is unable to attend. Please do keep yourself muted until we get to the Q&A portion so we don't disturb the speaker. If you can rename your little box to make sure it's your first name and last name, so that way if you are called upon or you are speaking, we can just address you by the correct name. The chat will remain open for collaboration and networking. Please feel free to utilize it. Any questions you ask, I will hold on to them until we get to the end of the presentation where we'll have a Q&A section, but feel free to throw in the questions or ask questions throughout. I will be here to answer them. Just make sure the questions you ask are not too personal. Again, this is being recorded. This will be posted on YouTube for everyone to be able to watch. All right, so I want to see who's here. I want to utilize the chat for you guys. And so please throw in the chat your name, the company you're with, your job title, your contact information, throw that in there. But before you hit send, I want to do a little fun piece of it. Put in what your favorite thing about the fall is. I know it's 90 degrees and hot and humid, but we're almost at the fall. School means fall. So throw in what you love about the fall time. I just threw mine in the chat. Mine is sweater weather. I almost wore my fall hat. I thought it'd be too much for this, but I can't wait. And taking hikes through the foliage when you hike and you see the beautiful scenery and the leaves changing. I just feel like hikes in the summer are not as amazing as the fall. So that's what I love about the fall. Feel free to throw your answers into the chat. This is also a great way, like I said, for networking, for people to have your contact information. Hey, Scott, Claire, fall festivals. Yes. Renfest is coming back.
Oh yeah, camping.
Claudia, camping. Great time of year to camp. The weather is going to be nice. Just grab a few extra blankets and you're set. Perfect bonfire season. Hey, Sam, sweaters and warm tea. Hi, Amy. Pumpkin spice lattes.
Oh yeah.
Andy, apple cider donuts. I will remember this about you now. Hi, Jill. The cooler weather. Hey, Chloe. I'm going to let you guys keep throwing these in here. Keep utilizing that chat. Keep getting to know each other. I love seeing the parents on here too. Thank you for joining. So at Fusion Academy, we serve both neurotypical and neurodiverse students. This topic is absolutely relevant to not just our teachers and our parents, but also the education and mental health professionals in our community joining today. So I just want to thank all of you for attending and learning today. A little bit about our speaker before I hand it off. So Dr. Joette James is a board certified in clinical neuropsychology by the American Board of Professional Psychology and currently serves on the DC Board of Psychology. Through the Stixrud Group, Dr. James provides individualized clinical assessment for individuals of all ages with neurodevelopment disorders, including autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, learning disabilities, and intellectual disabilities, as well as for individuals with acquired injuries to the brain. She also maintains a private clinical and forensic consultation and evaluation practice and has testified as an expert on federal, state, and local level on matters. I am getting tongue-tied, and I think this is a great time for me to pass it over to you, Dr. James.
No, not a problem. Bios are crazy things. So I'm just so honored to be presenting at the inaugural Lunch and Learn for this fall, and I just am really grateful to Olga for inviting me. We go back a ways, and I've had actually several students, and I have one now who is attending Fusion, and it's just been life changing for my kids that have gone there. It's been such a great fit for them, and I have parents literally just thank me over and over again. So I'm just really pleased to be here and to be speaking about this topic, and really anticipate hearing your questions and your comments. And just a couple of other little logistic things. I am actually not at home right now. I'm in a hotel in Lower Manhattan, so that's why my background looks the way it does. Thankfully, I think we have really good reception and internet connection. But yes, this is not where I live. And secondly, I am going to be primarily focusing, because this is what research I've discovered. I'm going to be primarily focusing on African American children in the special education system today, although I do have some slides you'll see about Hispanic and Latinx kids and some of the research I've been able to look at as far as cultural bias in the system. There is just, I've been doing this talk along with my colleague Marcy Jackson, whose name is up on the screen because I really want to acknowledge her, for the last couple of years. And I've actually been shocked and also not surprised by how the dearth of research in this area, particularly, I mean, there is some when it comes to African American children, but there is even less, almost nothing, in groups, other oppressed groups. So I encourage, it is just sort of like a call to action for more research in this area, maybe some graduate students who might be interested in, because I'm really surprised. I mean, I think that we're in a place where we're talking more about these issues now, which is great, and which is why we have these lunch and learns. But the actual research that is there is shockingly little. And I think that's also owing to just sort of these larger systemic issues. So that's why you'll see most of the emphasis today will be on African American children, but it's not to say that there are many other oppressed groups impacted. It's just that the research is not. We just don't have it right now. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next slide. So one of the things we think about when we think about our education system, right, is that it is there's so many things about our education system that are wonderful, especially when we think about resources just in a general sense and access in a general sense. That really is, we're very lucky to have, in comparison to some other countries where I've done work and traveled, and that's one of my hobbies, is to travel. And I have a very close connection, for example, to Jamaica, where my family is from. And, it's very hard, for example, in a place like Jamaica, to find a psychologist to do an evaluation. There's one psychologist, it would be one psychologist for, hundreds of folks. And especially in terms of doing evaluations for kids with developmental disorders. And so, in many ways, we are very lucky, even though, as this slide shows, access is not the same for all. Resources are not the same for all, and there is definitely disparity, and that is what we're going to be focusing on today. But I don't want us to lose sight of the bigger picture that in many ways, we're, even just having a special education system is not something that exists everywhere. I also want to acknowledge that in looking at these terms, and this term about race is coming from the APA guidelines, so the American Psychological Association guidelines on race and ethnicity in psychology, which I encourage folks to look at even if you're not a psychologist. And we're seeing more and more organizations, teachers, I know that teacher groups, psychology groups, psychiatry groups, medical professionals have really worked on constructing guidelines like these and really expanding on ethical rules and ethical guidelines to really bring these issues to bear. I myself, have kind of got an interesting history because I'm Canadian, grew up in Canada, spent the first 22 years of my life there before coming to the United States to come for graduate school in psychology. And so I've actually spent now more of my time in the United States than I have in Canada. And by thinking about race has really evolved over time. My thinking about ethnicity has evolved over time. And one of the things I did a couple of years ago that I found extraordinarily helpful was through an organization here in DC. It's Little Lights Urban Ministries. It is a nonprofit organization that provides affordable housing, does tutoring with kids. It's a great agency. But one of the things that I really love about it is that they also provide an anti-racism training. It's a 12-week course, and I took it during the pandemic, and I just learned an incredible amount. Because again, I came from Canada, so there was definitely a specific point of view that I learned there, and I just, it was a huge education to me to take this course. So I highly recommend it. Again, it's Little Lights Urban Ministry, but it made me challenge some of the things that I had heard as a child. I'm old enough to remember as a child being taught that there was a distinction. Now we know that to be false, between race as a biological concept and ethnicity as a complex cultural concept, which included things like national origin, language, traditions. That was a distinction that was taught to me, which is completely false. We know that to be false now. That race is really a political and social construction that results A, in this maintenance of a hierarchy, B, based on physical traits, perceived physical traits. But I remember being told that falsehood as a child. And I also remember some of the propaganda that I was told as a child, even sort of culturally between the United States and Canada. Canada was talked about as this place where you could, a mosaic was the analogy, where you hold on to your individual cultural values and you join this beautiful, wonderful country called Canada. So we're both sort of this individual within the context of being a Canadian. And goodness, you didn't want to be like the United States, which was the melting pot where you lost your individuality and your sort of cultural references because you were thrown in this melting pot called the United States, and being an American was more important than anything else. And that was certainly clear propaganda, and we know that neither of those things happen to be true. If you've been following anything about First Nations in Canada and how horribly folks were treated in the school system, in the foster and institutional school systems, you know that Canada also has a lot to answer for. So, I think this is part of the process, right? Where we're always challenging what we know, what we've heard, what are some of these implicit biases that develop as a result of, what we've learned in our childhood experiences. So when we talk about racism, we're talking really about this belief in superiority of one's race and inferiority of another race, and that there is this power structure that develops, and it can involve negative attitudes, feelings, and beliefs, and it's based on this notion. It's this false notion of perceived race as a biological concept, right? So that's essentially, this is another definition that is provided by these two researchers, Derman Sparks and Brunson Phillips. What I like about this definition, you can read it for yourself, but I think the focus is in the italics, that it's really about outcomes rather than intentions. So racism is measured by economic, cultural, sociological, and political outcomes. It's not by intention. So the effect on the marginalized group is really a function of that. It's a function of outcome and not intent. So you can act in a racist manner and do so unintentionally. And this is where we talk about, and I will be talking about in a moment, issues of implicit bias. So it's regardless of the person's good intentions. This is a really interesting topic, this notion of internalized racism, and it's this loosely defined as internalization by people of racist attitudes towards members of their own group, including themselves. And this can be conscious or unconscious, and it's about maintaining that hierarchy. And I think the best example, probably in from an African American standpoint or Black standpoint, would be colorism, traditionally rooted in the notion that folks with lighter skin colors and in the in quotes good hair were given more favor, given more privileges, linking all the way back to slavery, and that sort of internal attitude is pervasive even now. Interpersonal racism is the racism that we think about most often, that occurs between individuals. So when our own private, what we think of as private beliefs, come into interactions with others, now we're in this interpersonal realm, and we think about public expressions of bigotry and hate, and prejudice and discrimination. But I think in the past few years, we have been increasingly aware that racism obviously goes beyond interpersonal attitudes and beliefs and actions to more of an institutional, long-standing institutional concept, where discriminatory treatment, unfair policies occur in institutions and between institutions. So the way I sort of see institutional racism is really within institutions, and then we talk about in a moment structural or systemic. It's about that relationship between institutions. So these would be practices like discriminatory housing practices, school segregation, redlining, which was the denial of bank loans and mortgages, and up till today with exclusion from juries and disproportionate punishments. I do a lot of forensic psychology, so I see that not only in the schools, but and not only in mass media, but certainly in the criminal justice system, where, for example, an African American man is 10 times more likely to be charged with a death penalty offense, especially if the victim is white. So we see, how institutions themselves can, and individuals within institutions can take on that power when they act in racist ways. So again, when we talk about institutions, we talk about the individual organizations, or like the criminal justice system, the special education system, the real estate and banking system. But then we have relationships between systems, relationships between institutions that then form the basis of a structural system of hierarchy and inequity. And it's this preferential treatment, privilege, and power for people who are white at the expense of many oppressed groups. Cultural racism is not something that people talk about very much, but it's the idea of what is valued or associated in culture as being more normal or better, or what we define as beautiful, that can take place in advertising, in movies, how we think of policies and laws in history books, and it helps to justify laws and policies like racial profiling, because there is value that is put on one group versus another in a cultural setting. It's also, it's also partly, I think, when we think about what is beautiful, I remember as a kid, not having access, not seeing things like, my face represented or my skin color represented in dolls and toys and that sort of thing. My parents were really cool. They we lived in Toronto. They drove to Detroit to find me a black doll to play with because it was really important to them that I have something to play with that looked like me. And that in Canada, especially in the 70s and 80s, was not something that was readily available. But they wanted me to see beauty in my skin color, and that's something that we think of when we think of like sort of this idea of cultural racism. And it and cultural racism more subtly maintains systems because it's not overt, right? It defines what is beautiful, what kinds of cultural products are beautiful and valued, and what kinds of behaviors are valued in terms of, especially in terms of artistic expression. I just went to a talk in Las Vegas a couple of weeks ago. It was really fascinating, where someone was talking about, it was a conference, a death penalty conference, and I spoke there, and the speaker after me was talking about rap music and how individuals have not been directly convicted on the basis of rap music, but there's been this association between rap and hip hop and sort of criminality, again, sort of the devaluing of a cultural artistic expression. Um, it's a good example of cultural racism there. Sometimes people prefer to see these concepts visually, and it can be helpful to see this in context. So you can see the. I'm sorry, this slide is a little bit blurry, but I think it's mostly important for the visual. So you can see that the structural racism is really about communication between institutions, where institutional refers generally to an institution, and then you can see how individual and interpersonal racism is contextualized within. And I think the title is Four Levels of Change. So I think we need to think about how do we, I think in the past the focus has been on individual and interpersonal racism and ideas, but now we're in a place where we're thinking more and more about how do we address the problems on an institutional level. This is a really interesting concept and an important one, this idea of racial trauma, and the kinds of psychological and physical symptoms that people of color often experience after a stressful racist incident. And unfortunately, in this country, we think about this a lot in terms of mass shootings, where that have been racially motivated, or for example, situations like the Atlanta, the shooting of Asian American women in that context that were particularly targeted due to their race and ethnicity. And these incidents affect how people of color just function just generally after these incidents, especially as they are cumulative over time, and can induce these feelings of fear and depression and feelings of anger and anxiety, low self-image, have a traumatizing effect. So in terms of the things that we think about, what happens with trauma, right? Avoidance, flashbacks, nightmare, difficulties concentrating. And that's important to think about when these incidents occur in our communities, and we have students, we have clients that are coming to us that may be impacted, sometimes unconsciously, by the trauma of these situations. And we know that physical symptoms can also occur. I think this is less surprising to us now than maybe a few years ago when we heard about the adverse childhood experiences study. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that adverse childhood experiences not only resulted in psychological and mental health issues later on in life, more substance abuse and depression and other kinds of symptoms like that, but also impacted someone's functioning physically, in terms of obesity and heart disease. And we don't know those connections yet completely. We don't completely understand them, but we always have understood there to be mind-body connections, and how the body is impacted by stress continues to be something that's very true and related to racial trauma. This racial trauma can be transmitted generationally through storytelling, through dynamics in the family folklore, through physical and psychological symptoms. If we think of the Holocaust or the forced removal of First Nations, From their land, slavery, how these stories are recapitulated through generations, sometimes verbally, sometimes non-verbally, but these trauma-related symptoms are a real force and a real factor that affects people, affects how their viewpoints. And I'm actually going to stop talking because what I want to show you next is a little clip by Dr. Rihanna Anderson. She's an assistant professor at the University of Michigan, and she's going to talk a little bit about this concept of racial trauma. And again, we don't know exactly how this happens. It may even happen genetically. So I'm going to move on next to that. Please bear with me. I am a little bit of a technophobe, so I'm going to stop sharing, and then hopefully this will work out, and we'll go back to the PowerPoint, and I will resume sharing so that you can see her as well as hear her, which is what I'd like to do. So just give me a moment.
Source to contend with the
Looks good, Joette.
Okay, good.
So in the same way that trauma occurs across the lifespan, and in fact we have certain categories for children 6 and under and those 6 and older, racial trauma is quite readily available at any age. So we know that children as early as 9 months old can see racial differences. So that noticing, that acknowledging happens very early on. But what youth can tell you, I've worked with 5-year-olds before who have said, oh, like Tamir, oh, like Trayvon. So some of the racial traumas that we know are going to impact folks a little bit earlier because race is something that requires a bit more cognitive capacity to get. So at about 10 or so, you're starting to understand, oh, not only because I'm this race is this happening, but people around me that are this race, that's happening to them too. Oftentimes, parents who were once children themselves, you all hopefully remember that time for you, had instances in school where you were faced with a teacher that doubted your ability, a counselor who said you couldn't go to that next level, something that may have seemed innocuous at that point, but perhaps if you look back upon it, your ability to live your best life was encumbered by someone at school when you were young. So now you have a child, and maybe that child goes to the same school, and you're wondering, do I go to that PTA meeting to see that teacher who said something like that to me? Do I go back to that counselor to try to advocate for my child? And even if those people aren't there, that memory, we call it a memory, that memory is still there. So when we think about how parents' own backgrounds, how something that even happened to them can impact them now, that's one way that we're thinking about it. Another way, of course, is that direct relationship with what's happening to your child in this moment. So if a teacher, if a counselor, if someone from administration is impacting your child negatively, your child may not want to go to school. There may be some resistance there, and there may be friction even between you and your child as a result of that. If your child maybe isn't voicing what's going on, you may be very frustrated with your child. On the other hand, if your child is saying this is what's going on, it's related to race, you might be wanting to act on behalf of that child to go up to the school, and that might, again, be causing some tension there. So it manifests in so many different ways, but we also have to just be mindful. It may not be current stuff. It could be the things that happened to us in the past that are coming back, and the ways that it comes up now could be, if it's recognized or if it's not recognized, how that impacts our relationship with our child and our relationship with folks at the school. Racial trauma really stifles our children's ability to learn. I'll use an example that I talk about quite often. If a racial incident happens over a weekend, and there perhaps are conversations in the house, or maybe there aren't, right? But there's something that happens over the weekend, and your child goes to school. What's the first thing that happens at school? Does the teacher actually stop and address it? Is there circle time? Is there an opportunity folks journals to debrief if they're older. What is it looking like to give children not only the space to process, but you as a teacher, you as an administrator, the folks within that school, if they're thinking about what can I do to aid in this child's process, if that doesn't happen, the child is learning this is not important to folks who care about me, which means that my life is not as valuable. The folks who look like me aren't as valuable. And that's going to interrupt their ability to learn for that day, maybe that week, maybe that month. There are so many things that rest upon their identity, like what it is that people see about me. What time did we get to actually unpack that? So again, you can imagine that Monday, if it is not unpacked, whether at home or in the school, the child is not only getting those messages, but they're thinking about it. So it's taking up that cognitive space. Is it going to be me? So the teacher's teaching a lesson about math, and you're up here thinking about how many more years do I have to live, right? That's not the calculus that we should be thinking about as a child, but that's exactly what they have going on in their mind. It's taking up that space. It's taking their breath, their physical breath that they should be using in gym, right? It's taking it to make sure that they're breathing because they've heard that people can't breathe. These are all processes that are happening on that Monday and the following days. And if we as school leaders, as we as folks who engage with schools don't ensure that trauma is being unpacked and attended to, we're gonna have an entire grouping of children who are going to be so challenged dealing with these racial traumas either on their own or at home, but don't get that support at home, or at the school, that academic task, the thing that they're there for, isn't going to be able to be attended to.
All right. Hope you guys found that helpful. I'm gonna reshare my screen. Get us back to here.
I see your notes. Just want to.
I figured. Stop sharing. That might just have to be the way that it is. That's okay if that's the case. I am good with that. Where did I go?
Looks good.
Okay.
Oh, nope.
Nope.
You just closed it.
There we go.
There we go. Looks
Okay,
good.
great. Sorry guys for one of these days I'll get all this right. Okay. But I just thought that was important to see because we don't often hear folks talk about racial trauma. Okay, so who is valuable and why is this discussion important? Why is this issue important? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that first. So, we already know that students with disabilities struggle and we know this because there are statistics that tell us about higher rates of divorce in families when you have a child with a disability, higher rates of child trauma and maltreatment in families for kids who have special needs or disabilities. So it's like an extra layer of stress and an extra layer of something that has to be managed and dealt with when we're thinking about that layer of the issues that cultural bias bring in to families who are already struggling. And we need to appreciate the value, obviously, because for our children, we want, and especially for our children with special needs who we have a harder time sometimes identifying what are the strengths, what are the things that they bring to the table where there is leverage for the disabilities, and that balanced sense, a strength-based focus, thinking about strengths and challenges in our students and helping them to develop to their absolute fullest with a strong sense of self-worth and self-esteem, because we know that that's already an issue. We also, want to make sure that we're valuing our kids with disabilities and addressing these issues of bias, because this is this is life is a trajectory. Development is a trajectory, and these issues continue to impact folks at the post-secondary level and beyond. And we want our kids to have access to those post-secondary opportunities. We want them to have strong relationships with their teachers in a community setting, and we want them to be able to use their gifts, right? That's always when I evaluate a child or an adolescent or a young adult or even a wee little person, that is always my focus. What are the strengths in the context of the challenges that they face? We know that there is overrepresentation of African American youth, and and I just wanted to actually focus, Olga, there was a link there in the chat. If you could actually access that, or not access that, but and maybe after I read about this, it was related to Asian Americans, and I would like to get that out there as well. That there is this, disproportionality is an issue just in general. We know that African American youth and Hispanic Latinx youth are overrepresented in certain special education categories. This is from Maryland, but particularly in emotional disability and in intellectual disability. Those are the categories that both of those groups are overrepresented in. And we know for sure this is a strong statement, but that it is cultural bias, stereotypes, and incompetence when it comes to cultural understanding that is largely responsible for this. This is not accidental. Olga, are you seeing what I'm seeing in the chat? There was
Yeah.
a great comment about Asian Americans.
Yeah, from Claudia, and I'll include that when I email everybody with the recording. I'll include that link.
Yeah, that would be great. Okay. All right. So what is that impact? So we know that we've talked about racism as a system, right? It's certainly a systemic racism, in the racism that we see amongst institutions that encompass economic, political, social, and cultural structures. And it's a very normalized system that gives privilege and hierarchy to certain groups and not to others. And there's disparity, particularly with how Black and white students are identified and served in special education, even from the very beginning. So we see this is a slide about suspension and expulsion, but I can tell you right from the very beginning, from the process, the referral process, children in oppressed groups generally are not given the same amount of consideration by those primary referral sources. So like when we think about a pediatrician often being the gateway, Marcy and I did this talk initially for psychologists, and then we did it for medical professionals who were, so MDs, we did it for pediatricians. And from the very beginning in that referral process, we know that often parents of Black children, parents of Hispanic and Latinx children are not listened to by their pediatricians when they raise these concerns, or they're just not taken seriously. So we want to think of it from the beginning, from the referral process, and I'll take you through assessment and diagnosis. But this is an educational statistic when it comes to discipline, and children with disabilities in general face more unfair suspensions and expulsions, but children of color with disabilities are overrepresented within the special education population, and the disparities in discipline is even greater. So the big statistic here, as I said, Black children are twice as likely to be identified as having emotional disturbance and intellectual disability. They are less likely to be identified for gifted programs, and that's another statistic. And this is where there's an interaction between socioeconomic status and race and ethnicity, where we also know that individuals from low socioeconomic backgrounds and particularly children of color with lower incomes are less likely than their white counterparts to access those legal rights. That might be a lack of knowledge, that might be just a lack of access and opportunity to really understand and be exposed to what some of those rights are under IDEA, or they're not regarded or listened to when they have concerns. Again, there are multiple reasons for that. And disproportionality is this notion that a group's representation in a particular category, whatever category, exceeds expectations from that group or differs substantially from representation of others in that category. So we see that again from early on for African American children, beginning as early as infancy. There's an achievement gap, and uh, again with referral to Black children are less likely to be referred to early intervention programs. They are less likely to be identified as gifted, as I said early on, and we know that that continues up into graduation. So there's an achievement gap that is there, and there are some programs that I'm going to talk a little bit later about, a particular program in Maryland that is really targeted at looking at African American boys and trying to close that achievement gap, particularly around reading and writing. So it's a program targeted to young Black boys to improve reading and writing outcomes. And I don't have the reference on me, but if someone wants it, I'll always find it, that program, because it was really an interesting investigation study that was done, looking at all the ways in which we can close that achievement gap in Maryland. So this chart is busy, but again, it highlights the relative proportion of Black students, both at younger ages and then also in the school age years up until young adulthood. They're disproportionately identified as having ID or ED. And then that this continues on into discipline. So there's disproportionality in discipline. And you can see it for yourself there in the chart, looking at different groups and their likelihood of being suspended at least once. What we do also know is that there's some research to suggest that white students are disciplined for more concrete infractions, like skipping school, whereas Black students are more likely to be disciplined for more vague interactions, like things that are less operationally defined, like being disrespectful or disturbing others. So what we also know about that is that that while still in school, Black students with disabilities face ultimately losing 2.8 times the number of instructional days on average from suspension as white students with disabilities. So why do we care about that? Well, we care about that because suspending students really has a dangerous recourse. Missed time in school can lead to feelings of disenfranchisement from school, disengagement from school, can lead to paths where students start to hate school and hate the concept of school, and start to get into criminal activities as a juvenile, hanging around other peers who have similar disinterest and disenfranchisement in school, and can lead to the next slide that I'm going to be talking about, where I see most as someone who does work in the criminal justice system. So we talk about this school to prison pipeline, this notion that time missed from school and suspensions can lead to the greater likelihood involvement in the juvenile detention system, which then can lead to adult corrections. And once kids are in adult corrections, they're really lost to us. There's the likelihood that they come back to the juvenile system becomes just the lower and lower and lower. And this is why we call it the school to prison pipeline. We also know that there's a large proportion of folks with disabilities in correctional facilities. You can see these numbers here. 60% of people in local jails have some form of disability. And I see that myself. in correctional settings, all the way through from juvenile settings up to what I do a lot of, which is evaluating people on death row. There's just such a higher proportion of folks with intellectual disabilities, with autism spectrum disorders, with learning disabilities. It's quite shocking to see. And so this school to prison pipeline is a real thing. We also know that Black students, Black youth generally are perceived as older and tougher, and as a result are subject to harsher sentences. Even when folks do not end up in that school to prison pipeline, we know that in general, rates of high school graduation are much lower than those who do not have disabilities. And that's even more true for Black students, as they're much more likely to drop out of school. Again, leading potentially to involvement in the criminal justice system, but also just to not having the opportunities to then without a degree, being able to access jobs and vocational opportunities. There are definite workforce implications there. So again, we have in general folks with disabilities less likely to complete a bachelor's degree, but you can see that there are much higher unemployment rates. As I was doing research for this, I also looked at some research around discrimination in workplace settings that go beyond disability, that if you're there are statistics about folks being less likely to even get a job interview if they have a Black sounding name, if you can believe that. So it's really, there's a pervasiveness in the systems that go beyond school. Okay. So we're going to go back to thinking about special education now, and we also see in Hispanic and Latinx communities with students, they are also overrepresented in special education. And particularly, there is the potential for bilingual students to be much more likely diagnosed with a speech and language disorder, even when they don't have a speech and language disorder, and given inappropriate services because English is not their first language. So the belief is that they have a learning disability when they do not. Why do we have disproportionality? Well, I think there are many reasons. Again, we talked about discipline, that students excluded from the learning process are more likely to disengage. Students of color are more harshly disciplined for, sort of this idea of less status offenses and more determined to have behavior problems. There's subjectivity in placement decisions. So decisions can be made really more with the implicit bias of personal judgment and less on academic performance. So the observation of behavior, and I have parents of color talk to me about this all the time, worried about their kids with ADHD or other or autism spectrum disorders, and worried about how their children are perceived by teachers in school, seen as badly behaved as opposed to a child with a disability, and treated differently. There is variability in quality of instruction, again, leading back to the times where there was the ways in which where redlining occurred and African Americans were relegated to lower socioeconomic environments. We know that our schools are funded through property taxes, so that continues where there is disparity in terms of resources and what is available for students in lower income schools. There can often be this cultural mismatch, and we're going to talk a little bit in a moment about expectations of teachers, which can cause perpetuation of stereotypes. So there are lots of ways in which we can have we think that disproportionality originates. Teacher expectations do matter, and implicit biases really are referring to unconscious attitudes or stereotypes that affect understanding and actions in our decisions. And I think that's why they're so challenging, because they are, outside of conscious awareness. And teachers, what we know is that students, young students even, are able to perceive, teacher expectations. Even preschoolers and young kids, young as 6, they are able to recognize when folks hold stereotypes. I looked at there was a study that was done in neuropsychological evaluations looking at rating discrepancies. And teachers, but not caregivers, endorsed more inattentive symptoms and conduct problems for Black versus white children, irrespective of their diagnosis of ADHD or socioeconomic status, and after controlling for the sex of the child and learning difficulties. Teachers tended to endorse more hyperactive and impulsive symptoms for Black children with ADHD, especially if they were coming from a lower socioeconomic status. So teachers' expectations do really matter, and we know that there's some early research, some emerging research on how the student teacher interaction happens and how students may actually modify their own behavior to correspond or conform with those biases. This is a busy slide, but it really has to do with the fundamental issues that we've always had in the what we call the sort of the longstanding IQ gap of about 15 points, one standard deviation between African American and white examinees. It is decreasing, and but it has always been the subject of a lot of controversy. What we know now, we understand that IQ is mediated by a lot of factors, particularly psychosocial factors, low maternal education, low socioeconomic status, unsafe living conditions. There are all kinds of things that mediate IQ discrepancies, and particularly quality of education, which again leads back to discriminatory practices in housing and real estate. But that we know quality of education is a major source of bias and affects how IQ discrepancies work. So there are other potential sources of bias that we see here, including racial trauma and some broader cultural and familial structure factors. And this is a big factor here as well, and this is something that's ongoing, I think, in all of medical and psychological research. And I talk about this all the time when I do this type of talk for attorneys. That what we have is African American kids, Latinx kids, Asian American kids, and adults are often excluded from or not properly represented in samples and standardization samples for the tests that we give. And that's a problem because if folks are not included, then we're not getting the range, our tests are not being structured in a way that covers the range of skills, and there is basically a bias then that it will emerge in our tests. And even at the, I think what is interesting is that even our tests themselves can have content that is problematic. There's a very well-known test called the Boston naming test, and it's been in the last few years. It's a picture naming test where folks look at a picture and then they're supposed to identify it. And that test, up until a few years ago, still had a picture of a noose in it. And that can obviously be very disturbing, and it just wasn't changed until relatively recently. It's now gone, but these are the things that we don't think about often. Again, both the content of our tests and also issues of representation in normative groups when the tests are created. This is another potential source of bias that isn't talked about very often, this concept of stereotype threat, which is this fear of being judged based on a negative stereotype of a person's specific group, especially occurring when the race of the person doing the testing is different from the person who is the examinee. I've seen this operate in my criminal work with adults, and it's a very well documented phenomenon that encompasses IQ, but other kinds of tests in the neuropsychological world, but in work performance, et cetera. And so what happens then is that the person who's the examinee just ends up performing more poorly than they would because of this stereotype threat that is hanging over them about the negative stereotype of that particular group to which they belong. We also see higher levels of test-taking anxiety in African American middle school students that could contribute to them doing more poorly and changing their answers, for example, and second guessing themselves during evaluations. This would also artificially lower performance. The positive is that there are a number of factors that do seem to mitigate this effect. One is having a strong racial identity, and there are some other factors as well. I think when, just as in many areas, when you talk about the concept of stereotype threat, that can also lessen its occurrence. And when that's discussed and sort of unpacked. We know that there's cultural bias in assessment that impacts Hispanic and Latinx. We know, folks, there are a few providers that will provide developmental screening in Spanish, and Spanish language parents are often, where that's their primary language, they're often less likely to be asked about developmental concerns, even when a child is at risk for a developmental problem. And as I mentioned before, the Hispanic and Latinx parents often frequently report that providers do not listen to their concerns or provide the information that they need. That's been illustrated in a number of studies. Why is this all important? Well, it's also important because diagnosis is often complicated, and this chart is just an example where it shows reading disorder in the center. So just reading, what we used to call dyslexia, in the center. But the key here is overlap. We could take any one of these disorders and put them in the center, really. The point here is that there is tremendous overlap in comorbidity amongst disorders. And so it's hard enough already to make those distinctions, right? But when we have the additional factors of systemic bias and cultural bias, it makes that job, which is already challenging, even tougher. This is some interesting research by my colleagues at Children's National Medical Center that I just wanted to bring up. And it's specific to autism spectrum disorder. This is a study that they conducted relatively recently. We found that this is a specialized autism clinic. So it's the Center for Autism Spectrum Disorders at Children's Hospital, and I used to work there. So we're talking about a place that is a specialty clinic for children with autism spectrum disorders. And even in their clinic, what they found was after the age of 6, fewer Black children received a first diagnosis of autism in comparison to white children. The folks that did receive the diagnosis tended to have lower IQs and a greater number of autism symptoms. So that is, they were more obvious in the symptomatology, but basically what was happening was that kids with more subtle symptoms over the age of 6, like overly formal language or some trouble with making transitions, but not kids that were throwing themselves down or screaming or didn't have very obvious repetitive behaviors or restricted interests, those kids were being missed. What's interesting on the positive side is that under the age of 6, they did not find a disparity, and that shows that we're making some improvement with younger children in terms of early identification and early intervention, and that's a good thing. But we still have this lingering problem after the age of 6. What they concluded were there are a number of race-based biases, and you can see them on your screen yourselves, that they believe to be related to why this was happening, including reduced responsiveness to parental concerns, which comes up over and over again, particularly with related to mild symptoms. And just they found that white parents were more likely to seek out health professionals within this specialized autism clinic, and that might reflect access issues, because as kids age out of early intervention and county-based programs, which characterize their early years, they may have less access to specialty care. And there may be problems with the ways in which information about autism is communicated to Black parents, so that they would have the knowledge to properly associate some of the more subtle symptoms with autism. And so that's obviously a place where change needs to happen. We also see that Hispanic and Latinx children are less likely to be diagnosed with autism. And there again lies issues of stigma and lack of access, often due to English not being the first language, and some potential barriers that might exist there, with fears around not being a citizen or not having the knowledge to be able to seek out the appropriate services. So now we're getting to the good part, which is what do we do? And so, part of what we want to do is really an educational approach. And you guys all being here is part of that educational approach, right? So becoming more culturally competent oneself, having a better understanding and looking within about one's own implicit biases, one's own cultural identity and views, and really starting to think about this, attend seminars like this, talk to each other, really expand knowledge, right, and really think about how we are thinking about some of these issues. And I think secondary to that is the development of these more culturally responsive curricula. I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples of those in a moment, but really connecting to what culturally different students want to learn and presenting multiple viewpoints and really addressing in a very explicit way the ways in which cultural and systemic bias do affect us. The task force report comes from, it's called what I was referring to earlier. It's the Task Force Report on Transforming the Culture of Maryland Schools for Black Boys. And that was based on a three-prong approach looking at social, emotional, and behavioral sports, recruiting and training skilled, competent teachers and administrators, and it also related to curricula and instruction. One of the things that they did was to look at how to incorporate cultural values. So in many African countries, there are ceremonies that are done based on rites of passage at particular important times in a child or adolescent's or young adult's life, and bringing some of those rituals into our understanding of when kids are passing through these important stages and celebrating those. Again, sometimes that could be also spirituality and involvement in church, and how that might impact and how that might interact with the educational system. Also strategies that provide parents of color more access to information. In parenting classes, more access to information about different developmental disorders, especially making parenting classes accessible to low-income families, having documents about developmental disabilities professionally translated into different languages, providing information in video format, having in-person interpreters, having longer pediatrician visits for kids who are at risk, and doing things like connecting and providing support, high quality support for parents and caregivers. For example, introducing newly diagnosed families to a social worker, connecting them with a social worker or other families in the community for resources. So there are lots of ways to, again, bring this cultural responsiveness. And I think, at the end of it all, and this is where I'm going to finish up, we want to have a very, it's not just about it's really about taking a very active anti-racist approach where we use where we really think about our children and developing their strengths, especially our children with disabilities, and developing their skills, and really thinking about in a very active way dismantling some of these oppressive institutional practices and policies, and just building environments that obviously celebrate our kids and celebrate communities that are diverse. And that obviously is going to be something that is important and that really benefits us all. I want to just have a plug here for training for Marcy Jackson, the woman that I mentioned that I do this training with very often. She has from Weinfeld Education Group, which is a wonderful special education advocacy group. They have an online staff training that they do for teachers. You can see it here, and it's the information to access it is at the bottom. Through WEG's advocacy program. They do the training live in person, and they also do it on Zoom, and they also do it asynchronously as well. I'm going to end with and this is another program through Weinfeld Education Group where they offer free special education advocacy services for underserved students with special needs. So it's called See Us. So I'd like to make a little plug for them. They're unique in their mission for providing low cost or no cost advocacy for underserved students. And this is how to reach me. This is my email address and phone number, and also how to reach Marcy. And I am going to end there.
Thank you, Dr. James. Thank you so much for your time and your knowledge and expertise in this topic. Truly appreciate it. I see that already plugs for Diamonds in the Rough. It's in the chat, but I'm glad.
Yes, great.
We're wonderful.
Yeah, great conference. Yeah.
Fusion's also a sponsor, so please check.
Oh yeah, that's right. It's a small world.
But I want to open it up for questions. I have not seen any questions regarding this topic in the chat yet. So if you have a question, throw it in the chat. If you want me to ask it on your behalf, or I'm happy to open it up here if you want to ask your own question.
Happy to share the slides. Yes.
I was say, Dr. James, will you send me the slides and then I'll share it with the recording too, along with that link that Claudia shared? Awesome. Great resources, everyone's sharing. Thank you.
Oh, I'm glad.
Thank you, Mary Jo, for asking.
I have a quick question. I put it in the chat, but are there videos or on YouTube that anybody's created to help people understand? It's hard for everyone to understand SPED language and what all of it means. It's so complicated. I'm an advocate, and I also work directly with, at this point, teens and adults on the autism spectrum. Well, I call them complex because, of course, there's anxiety and all the other pieces that can be comorbid. But I was just wondering if those things already exist out there, because maybe somebody needs to make them.
Yeah, that's really good. Like, so just unlocking some of that special education language.
Yeah, because it's, well, for in a culturally sensitive way, for different cultures. I know because my son actually does, works with racial justice and resiliency and all that as a coach in those areas for teachers. And knows a lot about what you've been talking about today, and in ways that I think help people understand it. And I'm the special education person I've been doing for over 40 years. So it might be, if there's something that could be collaborated to make something like that, I think it would just even the very part of it. Well, do you think your child might have a disability, or do we even use the word disability? What's best to do for that? Because I think it's just the word disability has so much around it.
It does. I was I think that needs to happen. I love this idea of doing things like video presentations versus because then you're accessing more folks, right? High quality translations that are at lower reading levels for folks with different reading levels and reading comprehension levels. I think that needs to happen. I don't know of anywhere that has that distilled in one place, but I think these are all things that need to occur because they're just not happening at the in the way that they should. But yeah, it's so interesting that disability. I'm involved in Up County Community Resources. It's a Maryland-based nonprofit which provides all these amazing services for adults with developmental disability, intellectual and developmental disabilities. We just had a board meeting where we went through this quiz where we're talking about what's the language, right? Because some people really hate special needs, like they can't stand those terms. And then disability.
You have to ask them. I mean, basically ask. I say, what do you prefer?
Right.
I'm on the autism spectrum. No, I'm just neurodiverse. I mean, it really mattered to the person. Some people are like, autism, I really connect with that. Other people are like, nope, I don't want that. Yeah. So it's really being respectful to each person, because as we know, each person with any kind of anything is their own person and their own personality. And so it's like but I always say people never ask the kids.
They
They
never
never
ask the kids.
what do you want?
Yeah, they never
Like,
ask the kids.
do I have a choice?
And it gets complicated. I mean, there are folks that have reclaimed the word, autistic and use that. And then, we were talking, but then there are still, people first language.
Right.
The folks that prefer the people first language, and this idea that one is more than, right? And then it's more complicated by the fact that even when we look at different countries, the intellectual disability, that what we call intellectual disability here, is not what they call intellectual disability in the UK, for example. So yeah, it's
So it's like we need the translation for all of those things and what it
yes,
means, and what it doesn't mean.
yeah,
You know?
and access for parents of all, all types. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. Really appreciate it and the answer. Lisa, I saw your hand up. I wanted to give you a chance to see if you still have a question.
Yeah, it was kind of a question, and I think Dr. James covered it quite well. But I'm in the DEI field, several years ago, I was a parent liaison in Fairfax County, and I cannot stress how important, Dr. James, you talked about how children of color, Black children and brown children, Latino children, African American, are diagnosed more frequently as being special ed and then just left. And so their parents are like, what do I do? And then as they get older, they're the troublemakers. You're seen as, they get yanked out of school, they get suspended, and there's no support services. And then you talked about the whole thing about stereotype threat. That's my big thing these years. But what happens in society about how these children are viewed, and then how these adolescents are viewed. And it's so detrimental and so destructive that it's really hard to put something in place. And what I have found, that many friends of mine who know that I do DEI work, they say, what do I do? What do I help my kids? Because they are left out of the system. So many pull their kids out because they have a lot of money, and they put their kids in private schools, the ones that can. So I'm not going to put up with this. At least if they're paying, they think they're going to get better services. It doesn't mean this special needs or the autism goes away. It's how is that addressed? So I think your research is really important. And I just want to say, you're finding out your research. I think it's just it's destructive. It carries these kids throughout their lives. Were you seeing some of that in your studies? And so the question is, personally, I don't think many of us in this field see how detrimental it is to these kids. I mean, it affects their whole life, and then their everything. They can't even get a high school. I mean, more so than white kids who have been diagnosed. There's a difference there. Yeah. And we in the profession are not trained enough. Now, I work mostly adults now, but I'm starting to see in my where I teach at the university, a lot of kids with neurodiversity who have either received help or who haven't. And I know some of the white kids have been in special schools, and they say, I went to the school where very few of the children of color have. They'll talk about it. Yeah. They'll tell me. So the question is where do you see us going? Big one here as a profession to deal with this, to really, because we're losing generations. It's happened before. We're losing generations of kids.
Yeah. Well, I think the more that we're able to make those connections, right, between systems and between institutions, the better off. Like I mean, I feel like because I think people see them as separate, but they're not. They're super connected. And I can't tell you how many reports I've read where I just see kids, Black kids with disabilities just falling off the cliff. And then the next report I see is, and this is someone that's on death row. Okay. So I have years, and I read, like, I almost cry because I see like the early reports when they're 4 or 5 or 6. And like, so-and-so is trying really hard, but it's really hard for them to read. And, please read to them more at night. And then they just fall off a cliff by like 9th grade. And then the next thing you know is that, there's truancy, and then they're in the criminal justice system. And once you're in, it's hard to get out. So I think, I mean, that's the question you're asking is the $1 million question. How do we do a better job of kind of being aware of these connections between institutions and, really targeted intervention? I mean, this project that I was talking about, the Maryland project, is really cool because they really looked at how do we intervene in all of these different areas in terms of how do we intervene with providing quality, intervention. It was specifically directed to Black boys with reading and written language disorders. And then also thinking about curriculum, thinking about high quality teachers and of color. I mean, it was a whole sort of their findings were hitting multiple aspects of the system. I mean, that's the only way to do it.
Right. And if I can just add one thing to, I have a daughter who taught in Philadelphia schools. She's still a teacher there, now a reading specialist, and would pick up things early and tell the system whatever. And this is not to put down any school system, but they're saying that sometimes you could not give a diagnosis. Well, she wasn't allowed to diagnose, but they did not want you to give a kid a diagnosis or send them someplace too soon, even if you're seeing things.
Yeah.
And then many parents they didn't want that to be done to their kid early on. And I understand that. It's like, oh, what a double bind. So I was like, wow. I was like, this is what, in my head, I'm going, what a mess. I'm glad I'm not doing it. I don't mean that to throw up my hands, but I think of how tough can that be?
How
Literally, the system says, don't do that. You can't give a diagnosis until later. You get them through. It's like, well, first grade where they're learning to read and learn how to socially be in a classroom, that's when you want to do it.
That's when you want to do it. You don't want to
not
wait.
When they're teenagers, when the hormones in when they're first grade. That's my thoughts. So I don't know.
Yeah.
So.
I will tell you, I have my experience, and I don't know about others, but my experience as a neuropsychologist is that parents are trusting us more to have these conversations that I didn't even hear 10 years ago.
Great.
Like, I mean, I find that I get referred a lot of parents of color, a lot. But, which I think is great because we end up having these conversations about their kids and their worries, and they're revealing those worries about how their child is being viewed in the educational system because he has, he's forgetful and he has attention problems, and then he's being labeled a bad boy, and those worries are yeah, I mean, folks are expressing them now in ways that I did not see even 10 years ago. I think that's encouraging.
Yeah. Well, it's phenomenal what you do, and thank you very much. I was taking a lot of notes. I'm not practicing, but you might get several referrals from me. I was like, oh, because the fact that you do this is your specialty.
Yeah.
That's the thing is the parents are sometimes afraid to come. They don't want to, that it can be scary. It's hard enough just to raise a kid, but to add something extra, it can be a little scary. But
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Lisa, for your question. We do have 10 more minutes. So if you guys have any more questions, happy to answer those. Otherwise, I'm happy to give you 10 minutes back on a Friday.
And I actually have to take off myself because I have to check out of my hotel.
Oh, no.
Which was the phone call that I just got. And it is New York City. So
they need the room.
But you have my contact information, and if folks want to contact me to chat more, I see some really great recommendations here around books. My Grandmother's Hands, White Fragility. These are awesome. I've read both of those books. And so, yeah, if folks have questions, and I will send those slides, folks can feel free to contact me at any time. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. James. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Again, I truly appreciate it. Thank you for being part of our community and willing to learn from one another. I truly appreciate it. Yeah, have a wonderful weekend, a beautiful fall season. Take care.
All right. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.